Welcome back. This is day 5 of evolution, and today we're going to be talking about how do we use genotypic evidence to support evolution. Now, this word genotypic is new, but it looks really similar to that word we learned in our genetics unit called genotype. And remember when we talked about an organism's genotype, we were just looking at the genes that they have. So when we see this word genotypic evidence, we're just talking about the similarities in genes between organisms, or even just the similarities in the DNA sequencing. So we're just talking about genetic evidence. And today we're going to be talking about genetic evidence as well as a few different types of evidence that actually support the theory of evolution. But before we get to that, you guys have got a do now. So I want you to pause this video and tell me, how do mutations impact evolution? All right, so pause this video, press play when you're ready to review it. All right, how do mutations impact evolution? So remember, when we see this word mutations, we're just talking about changes in the DNA sequence. And when we see this word evolution, we're just talking about change over time. Now, changes in the DNA sequence or mutations are what lead to genetic diversity. That's where we get our variation from, or it's what contributes to it at least. And if we didn't have genetic diversity, if we were all the same, that means that natural selection wouldn't happen, because there would be no better traits to choose from. We would all be the same. And if there was no natural selection, that means we wouldn't have any change over time or evolution, right? So in a way, mutations actually directly lead to evolution, because mutations give us the changes in DNA, which contributes to genetic diversity, which is what allows for natural selection to happen, which is what causes that evolutionary change over time. All right. So today we're going to be talking about a few different types of evidence that support, there it goes, that support evolution, or the theory of evolution, I should say. Okay, but first we're going to be reading through a quick passage called "What Evidence Supports the Theory of Natural Selection?" So since Darwin first proposed his ideas about biological evolution and natural selection, different lines of research from many different branches of science have produced evidence supporting his belief that biological evolution occurs in part because of natural selection. Because a great amount of data supports the idea of biological evolution through natural selection, and because no scientific evidence has yet been found to prove this idea false, this idea is considered a scientific theory. Because lots of evidence supports scientific theories, they are usually accepted as true by a majority of scientists. So today we're going to be talking about a few different types of evidence that support evolution. And as we go through each of these examples, I'm going to ask you guys to refer back to this list. And we're going to figure out, is this molecular evidence, meaning talking about the biochemical building blocks of organisms like amino acids? Is it genetic evidence, where we're comparing the DNA between organisms? Is it geological evidence, which is when we're talking about the Earth's structure and its substances? Or is it phenotypic evidence, which means we're talking about the observable physical or structural similarities between organisms? So if you want to write down these definitions or just refer back to this slide, we will come back to these definitions a few times throughout this lesson. All right. So the first example of evidence that we've got is biochemistry. Biochemistry is the study of the basic chemistry and processes that occur inside cells. And biochemistry actually shows us that all of Earth's organisms share a common ancestry. So if you look here at this amino acid chart, we can see that amino acid sequences actually reveal evolution. We can see that chimpanzees have 0 amino acid differences from humans. We have the exact same amino acids. Rhesus monkeys only have 1 difference. Rabbits have 9, right? And what does this show us? Well, it shows us that we all share a common ancestor. Our amino acid sequences are really, really similar. So this is going to be an example of molecular evidence, right? We're looking at those molecular or biochemical similarities between organisms. All right. Next up, we've got comparative anatomy. Now, anatomy is talking about the structures that make up our bodies. And if we're comparing it to something, that means that we're comparing the structures of different living things, right? So what does comparative anatomy show us? This is, comparative anatomy shows us that the best explanation for similarities is that various species on Earth, again, evolved from a common ancestor. I'm seeing a theme here. Now, if we're looking at the structural similarities between organisms, what type of evidence do you think this is? It's going to be phenotypic evidence, right? We're looking at those physical or structural similarities between organisms. So I've got an example of what this looks like on your paper. So I want you guys to examine the comparative anatomy of the bones in the front limbs of humans, cats, whales, and bats pictured to the left. And now I actually want you guys to tell me, are these bones homologous or analogous? But what do those words actually mean? Let's go over those. So when we're talking about homologous structures, remember homo means same, so that means that they evolved from a common ancestor. And that also tells us that the organisms are closely related. But when we see this word analogous, analogous structures mean that they evolved towards a common adaptation. So this means that those organisms are not necessarily closely related, but their structures, and this is important, their structures have the same function. So I've given you guys one example of homologous structures, and that means that they've evolved towards a common adaptation, like the wings of an insect and the wings of a bird, right? Insects and birds probably aren't too closely related, but they've evolved the same adaptation, right? They both use those wings to fly, so they have the same function. So now looking at these structures over here, do you think these are homologous structures or analogous structures? Do they have the same ancestor or the same function? Well, humans, what do humans use our arms for, right? We use them to grab things like my coffee. We use them to point at things, to pick things up, exactly. But bats, what do bats use their wings for? Well, they use them to fly. Now, if I move my hands fast enough, am I gonna fly? Do those structures necessarily have the same function? No, I mean, maybe just maybe, if I wave them fast enough, I'll pick up some ground, but probably not, right? So that means that we don't necessarily have the same function. So this actually tells us that these structures are homologous, meaning they evolved from a common ancestor. These organisms are closely related. And if you look at the bones on these structures, they've actually been color coded to show that those bones are the same across the species, right? So eventually, or somewhere down the line, each of these structures evolved from the same ancestor. All right. Moving on to biogeography. Biogeography is the study of living things around the globe. And what does biogeography show us? Well, it shows us that groups of organisms that are related to one another will be clustered near each other because related organisms, again, come from the same common ancestor. So if you look at this map I've provided, you can see that originally, once upon a time, all of the continents on Earth were together, right, through Pangea. But as those continents broke apart and organisms were separated, we start to see evolution occur. And we'll talk more about that next week. But we can see that these organisms that are closely related are actually clustered close to each other. So what type of evidence is this? It's biogeography, which means it's probably geological evidence, right? Because we're talking about the Earth and its structures. Right, next up, we've got comparative embryology, where we're comparing the embryos of developing organisms. And what does comparative embryology show us? Well, again, it shows us that we probably have a common ancestor, right? All life on Earth shares a common ancestor at one point or another. And I've shown you guys some pictures of some embryos of different organisms down here. We see an embryo of a bird, of a reptile, of a human, and a pig. And what do you guys notice? Well, these embryos all look really, really similar. Now, later as they develop, those differences start to develop or start to show up, right? We don't look closely related to pigs. We don't look closely related to reptiles, but early enough on in development, those embryos are almost identical, which again shows us that there's probably a common ancestor somewhere down the line. Right, and this is an example of phenotypic evidence because again, we're looking at these structural or physical similarities. All right, next up, we've got molecular biology. This is focusing on the structures and functions of the molecules that make up cells. Now, if we're looking at the molecules that make up cells, what type of evidence do you think that is? It's going to be molecular evidence, right? And molecular biologists that have studied gene sequences among different species have once again indicated that there are similarities amongst even very different species. If you think way back to that very first chart we looked at with the amino acid sequences, actually I can pull it up, right? We saw that even amongst species that we don't think of as very closely related to us, like a cow, there's only 10 different amino acid sequences than the ones we have, right? So 10's not that many differences. Even things like a pigeon only have 12 different amino acids from us, right? So there are very, very close similarities between organisms, which shows us again that there is a common ancestor somewhere down the line. All right. Now, next up, we've got paleontology, which is the study of prehistoric life through fossil evidence. And what do the fossil records show us? Well, they show us that there is, again, detailed evidence of the changes in living things through time. So we can uncover fossils like this one right here of a dinosaur, and we can compare it to species that we have today and look at those similarities between the structures and look at how things have changed and evolved over time. Now, since we're looking at these structures, or the physical evidence of these fossils, what type of evidence do you think it is? Well, it's going to be phenotypic evidence, right? Because we're looking at those structural similarities, but we can also consider it genetic evidence as well, because sometimes if we're lucky, we can pull a DNA sample from those fossils and actually compare the DNA to what we have today. All right, which brings us to modern examples of evolution. This is a screenshot taken from a lab that has been studying evolution. Oh no, it says I'm unstable. I'm gonna say that slide again because I'm not sure what it lost. But this slide we're going over right now is looking at modern examples of evolution, right? So we can actually use scientific experiments to measure evolutionary change happening around us today. So this screenshot is taken from a lab, or data from a lab that has been studying the evolution of E. coli, the bacteria, for the past 30 years. And they're looking at the genome sequences of those evolving species of E. coli, right? And so if we're looking at the genomes of an organism, what do you think this evidence is? This is going to be an example of genetic evidence. So there's a lot of really cool experiments measuring evolution happening today. If you're interested at all, Google it and let me know what you find out. All right, and the very last type of evidence we're going to talk about today is radioisotope dating, which is how we estimate the age of fossils. Oh, that's out of order. Well, it's molecular and geological evidence, and I'll tell you why. So radioisotope dating shows us a few things. So isotopes are different forms of the atoms that make up matter on Earth, and you'll learn more about this in chemistry next year. But some isotopes are called radioactive isotopes, and they actually discard or throw away particles over time, or they don't really throw them away like in the trash can, but they just emit them. They emit them over time and change into other elements, which is a really cool process. But it's through this process that scientists are able to know the rate at which this radioactive decay occurs. So we can take different rocks and different samples from the Earth and analyze the elements that are inside of them. And this is what helps us figure out how old things actually are. I completely lost there we are. Now, radioisotope dating indicates that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It's super old, which is plenty of time for these evolutionary changes to have occurred, right? So since we're looking at rocks and structures that are found within the Earth, this is going to be a geological evidence. And so, since we're looking at these similarities, as well as the molecules that make them up, this is also going to be molecular evidence. All right, now that is all I've got for you guys today. So go ahead and fill out your exit ticket, submit these notes on Google Classroom, and have a wonderful afternoon. I'll see you guys soon.